Hi there. I'm today putting on my Dr. Christy Winters hat and using my training in political behavior to answer the question, who in the GOP base really supports Donald Trump? And the answer, as I think you'll see, is everybody. In this video, I'm going to do a little overview of an experiment that was done that kind of sets the stage for taking the temperature of the GOP electorate. Then I want to look more specifically at some Pew Research results and look at how the candidates are performing overall, and then look at how they're performing amongst the various demographics. And I want to then at the end just restate my observation that the establishment candidates really can't wait for Trump to flame out. The people who are supporting Trump really don't care for their policies or what they're putting forward, and that is the problem the establishment, in my view, is facing. A little background about me in case you don't know. I have a PhD in political behavior, and I'm very interested in watching and understanding the Republican GOP race. So I've spent a lot of time looking through survey data and other articles reviewing people's opinions to formulate what I think is an accurate representation of what is happening in the GOP electorate. And in this video, we're going to be using primarily, actually exclusively, descriptive statistics. We're going to be looking at cross-tabulation, where we look at candidates' support by various demographics. And this kind of analysis can't do any inferential assumptions. I can't prove causality here. All I can do is tell you a lot about, a lot about the people who responded to this survey and what they're thinking and how they kind of group together in terms of education and income, sex, and religious, like attendance, age, and income. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at descriptive statistics that give us a feel for the types of people who are backing each candidate. The first thing I want to start with is a little piece of research that was written up by David Axelrod, who I think we can agree generally has a very firm grip on the electorate. He wouldn't have been successful in 2 presidential elections if he didn't understand the electorate. And he wrote up a little piece on CNN about the apprentice effect. And I thought it was quite interesting and something that you should know about to contextualize where Trump supporters are coming from. This piece was written by David Axelrod, and the research was conducted by AMG, a media planning and analytics firm, and he sits on their board. The question that the analytics firm asked was, what impact does watching The Apprentice have on Trump's support? And what they found was, while it was not a huge effect, it was statistically significant in that it was, I think, outside the margin of error, which the margin of error on this poll, or this result, is 6 points. AMG fielded an online poll of self-identified Republicans on the 17th and 18th of September. This was 2 days after the CNN debate, and their results in terms of how the candidates performed was very similar to other polls, but they asked an interesting question on whether or not people watched The Apprentice. And as you can see from this result, that when you examine voters by whether or not they view The Apprentice or when they don't, you'll see that people who view The Apprentice have a 62% approval rating for Trump, whereas non-viewers are really tied. There's something to be said here about the way that Trump performs in these debates or performs on TV. If you've seen him in his show, you're actually kind of conditioned to view him in that positive light. There's an effect in psychology known as, I think it's like the moderator effect or the show host effect, and that's if you are in charge and you're the one asking the questions and directing things, you just look more competent than the contestants because you always have the right answer. Alex Trebek on Jeopardy looks really smart because he always has the answers, but that's just an effect of, the situation of who has power. And so when you see Trump on television performing in those positions of power, that seems to translate in some sense to how people view then the other candidates around Trump, and they're more likely to view him favorably. Now that's I don't want to say that psychological effect is why Trump is viewed more favorably than the non-viewers of The Apprentice, but at least it's an explanation as to how his celebrity status gives him a kind of credibility with viewers that other candidates don't have. Moving on, we're going to look now at the Pew results that were put out just in the last, 24 to 48 hours. But in particular, I want to go over what the margin of error is and how the poll was conducted at the beginning, because this is important. It is important to keep in mind the margin of error while we're going through this. And I'm not constantly going to refer to the margin of error, so I want you to kind of keep it in your mind, plus or minus 5.5%, which we're going to be looking at here. These Pew numbers are were collected using telephone interviews from the 22nd to the 27th of September. It's a national sample. In total, it's 1,500 adults, all over the age of 18, living in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And you can look on the screen there to see the particulars as to how people were interviewed. And in terms of the sample size and the margin of error, I'm going to show you their table to show, because we're going to be looking specifically at Republicans in this analysis, that based on the 421 participants in the overall sample, the GOP results I'm going to be showing you are going to have an average, a margin of error of plus or minus 5.5%. When I looked at the Pew numbers, this is what I've concluded at the end of my analysis. They prefer new ideas over a political experience by a margin of 65 to 29%. 33 of those who prefer new ideas and a different approach name Trump as their first choice. In the base, what they want is for a candidate who is close to them politically on issues rather than being electable in a general election. 67% of them think it's more important to pick a candidate who comes closest to representing their views. GOP voters right now are rating their candidate options higher than they did in 2007 or 2011. 59% of Republicans right now rate their options as being positive, compared with 49% and 50% in previous election years. And there's also this sort of thing being said in the media that people aren't paying attention to the election yet because there's school starting and it's Labor Day and it's holidays and people aren't going to tune in to January. Well, the GOP base is paying attention. 81% of voters have thought a lot or some about the presidential candidate, and that is up from 2007 and 2011. So the GOP base is engaged. It's happy with the candidates that it has on offer, and it wants to pick people who feel like them, who, when they look in the mirror, and they look and sound closer to that core base than being a professional who can get elected. And from this point on, everything that I'm going to be showing you comes from the Pew Research Center, and links to that and the Axelrod article are in the description box below. The Pew results that we're about to look at are the result of an open-ended question. Using that open-ended method, 25% of possible Republican and Republican-leading primary voters in the sample reported that Donald Trump would be their first choice for GOP nominee. We can examine this table that I created using Excel this morning while I was drinking tea and preparing to make this video. And I've included the don't knows because I think it's important to look at what proportion of the sample has not made up their mind yet. So we can see here, and again, there's a plus or minus 5.5% margin of error in this. Trump coming out in this most recent Pew survey at 25%, Carson at 16%, and you've got Rubio and Fiorina coming in tied for third. I'm going to focus on Trump for the remainder of this video, but at the end, if I remember, I want to talk about how much trouble Jeb Bush is in. A few other things about Trump's supporters. Among those, 43% of potential primary voters for the GOP who say that they are likely to support a candidate who wants to deport all immigrants now living in the country legally. 34% of that 43% give Trump as their preferred candidate. He also gets the most support, nearly 1/3, when it comes to who would be those voters who would support someone inclined to raise taxes on the wealthy. So this is kind of the populist base of Trump's support. What I want to do in this video is really unpack these by demographics and demonstrate where Trump's support is coming from and how much he has using this information. When you start looking deeper into the numbers on that table, you'll notice that Trump is coming in first among men, women, 18 to 49-year-olds, people 50 and over, people with some college, people with high school or less in terms of education, people who make $75,000 or less per year, $40,000, all the income levels basically. He also is first amongst those who identify as conservative Republicans and those who identify as moderate and liberals, and he is first among those who attend church less than once per week. He comes in second place with people who are college graduates and those who attend church on a weekly basis. Now we're going to evaluate the candidates by category. What I've done here in these slides that we're about to look at is on the upper left-hand corner, you'll always see the distribution of the category by its percentages in the sample. That's to say, of the people in the sample who responded and identified as GOP or GOP-leaning registered voters who plan to vote in the next election. 47% of those respondents were women, 53% were men. And now we're going to look specifically at GOP-leaning men, which make up 53% of the sample. That means that if Trump is supported by men at a greater rate than he is supported by women, and there are more men, it demonstrates that he's got basically more support in the base because he's disproportionately ahead with men, and men are disproportionately a larger part of the voting bloc. So this is how I'm trying to get you to see where people's strengths and weaknesses lie. I hope it's being communicated in a clear way for you. From this slide, you can see that Trump is leading with GOP and leaning GOP men over Carson, 28% to 17%. Now, this is a subset of that registered voters, so we might be getting into a larger margin of error because we're looking exclusively here at men, but we can still see that that trend of Trump holding a commanding lead over the rest of the field holds for men. It also holds for women, although the race is much tighter. Carson and Trump are probably here within the margin of error, especially if we look at it as a subcategory of all GOP voters. So the GOP voter subcategory has like a 5.5% margin of error. This is only women, so it's probably even greater. In terms of the age, and I've just put cohort here, even though it's really only two cohorts, people over the age of 50 and people under the age of 50 who can vote at 18, you'll see that from the entire sample, people over the age of 50 make up 58% of the total sample. So older voters, we know GOP voters tend to be older. This isn't that surprising. And the younger voters make up 42%. And here you'll see that Trump is out ahead 10 points. So, again, with the margin of error, but he's still leading with 18 to 49-year-olds, with only 22% of them saying that they don't know who they're going to vote for yet, which is slightly less than the overall sample. Amongst older voters, Trump is not performing quite as well. He is still out and ahead of Carson, but the margin, as you can see, is much smaller than it was with people under the age of 50. And that might be down to a lot of things. One might be viewership, but of course I'm speculating here. But Trump does seem to be connecting with the younger cohort than with the older cohort. And you can see that 26% of them are still undecided. The next three slides are going to look at the breakout by education. And those categories are people who are college graduates, people who have some college, and people who have a high school degree or less. Those are all clumped in. I would imagine that the vast majority of those would be people with high school education, but they don't have a separate category for people who didn't graduate from high school, probably because the percentages were so small. So that gets lumped in together. And as you can see, there's a general 30-30-30 breakdown, with slightly more people likely to have some college or high school degree than a college degree in this sample. And we can also see that this is one of the places where Trump comes in second, although it's really close. I mean, again, this is sort of statistical dead heat in terms of where the sample is based on the margin of error. But in terms of the fixed point, Carson does end up at 18, whereas Trump ends up at 16. So there's a possibility that that's a real thing in the numbers, that college graduates are a little bit more likely to support Carson than Trump. You can also see here that Carly Fiorina gets 10% support and Marco Rubio 11%. These are kind of your establishment voters, people with college degrees, and we'll also see later on people who have more money. These are the establishment type, so it makes sense that Rubio and Fiorina would do well with college grads who supported outsider candidates and college grads who are supporting establishment candidates, because Jeb Bush has just turned out to be such an awful candidate who keeps putting his foot in his mouth. And you'll also see here that 26% of these respondents are still undecided. Amongst voters with some college education, you can see that Trump goes back into first place, Carson is right behind him, and then Rubio and Fiorina are supported, although their support doesn't break 10%. And 26% of these respondents said that they still don't know who they would be voting for. With those who have a high school degree or less, we can see that Trump is way out in front with 30%. Carson's at 9%. And then third place goes to Ted Cruz. And that's, I think, interesting. It's one of the areas where he performs well. So it's one of the few demographics where he gets close to double-digit numbers, which says a little bit about the kinds of voters that he is going for and that are attracted to him. However, we see that fully a third, almost a third, I should say, 29% of these respondents say that they don't know who they're going to vote for yet. So that's not untypical. I think people with less education tend to decide later. So that's not an entirely surprising result. Their views might also be a bit more fluid than someone with a college degree for reasons that we can go into in terms of cognitive engagement. So, but the thing to take away from this is that Trump does very well with those who have a high school degree or less. We're now going to look at support by income brackets. And as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, the Republican base is freaking rich. 43% of them make at least $75,000 per year. Then after that, you've got 26% who make $40,000 to $75,000. It's actually 7,499. And then 1/3 of them, less than 1/3, 31% make $40,000 a year or under. And amongst those voters who make money, Trump is still in the lead with 21%. Carson is just behind him at 18. And then look at this number for Fiorina, 12%. I think what we can conclude from this is that Fiorina's support is really amongst those who are wealthy. And I'll show you in a minute how different it is by the different income groups. So her surge, it looks like to me, is really from a series of people in that income category of more than $75,000 per year, shifting or moving behind Fiorina. You can see even Marco Rubio is behind her at 9%. And this is interesting when we compare it to other people in this income bracket. So moving ahead, we can see that for those people who make $40,000 to $74,900, she's down to 1% support. I think that that's really, really surprising. Now, in fairness, the margin of error is 5.5%. So there could be some error in the sample, but it is striking, and I think it's worth paying attention to, that Fiorina isn't necessarily a broad-based candidate. It looks from this like she's a candidate for rich people. Finally, for those who make under $40,000, this is the Trump base. Fully a third of the people in this category identify Trump as their preferred candidate, with Carson well behind. Basically, everybody's behind. The problem for Trump in this category is that they make up only 31% of the total base. So if you had 43% of the people in that base, if you swap around the 75K and the 40K, Trump's total proportion would be even bigger. But because this one category, even though they support him at 32%, they're a smaller part of the overall pie. So that it reduces the impact that his support has in the general GOP world. The last category we're going to examine is religious service attendance. And in this sample, it broke out pretty much 50-50. 51% of respondents reported that they went to religious service less than once a week, and 49% said they went every week. And amongst these attendees, you can see Carson pips Trump again. So these are the two places that Trump comes in second. The first one being with college grads, whereas Trump performs better with people who have high school degrees or less. And here, when it comes to weekly attendees, you can see that there's a massive difference when we look at people who go less than once a week. And that is where Trump's supporters come from, that 32% to Carson's 14%. And again, just to compare, if you go to church every week, you're a little bit more likely to support Carson than Trump, although 27% of these respondents are undecided. If you don't go at least once a week, Trump is most likely your preferred candidate, with only 22% of these respondents saying that they didn't know who they were going to support. Using this information, we can build up a kind of typical Trump voter. And he is male, under the age of 50. He's got high school degree or less, but probably a high school degree. He makes less than $40,000 per year and identifies as a conservative Republican. And I'm saying that because the conservative identifiers are a larger proportion of the entire base. And he attends church less than once per week. That is the person who is really Trump hits that category of voters' sweet spot. I've spent a lot of time in this video looking really at Trump's supporters in particular, but I think it is worth examining the other category, not the professional candidates because they're going to drop out, but the establishment candidates. And in this survey, there are only two really credible establishment candidates that made the list, and that is Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush. I'm not going to do a similarly in-depth analysis of these guys' support simply because it's so small. It's not really, everything is within the margin of error, so it makes it harder to say things that are concrete. But we can examine the pattern of the way that their support breaks up by the demographics we've already looked at. This isn't the most beautiful chart in the world, but it'll give you a little sense of where those two candidates are. And the overall takeaway is that Bush is a weak candidate, and Rubio is increasingly being seen as an alternative, in my view, based on these numbers. You can see that Marco Rubio is leading with men and women. He's leading across the education category, he's leading across the income categories, and he's leading across church attendant respondents. He does especially well with people who go to church on a weekly basis in comparison to Jeb Bush. And that might be a really important factor given the role of half the respondents in the sample went to church on a weekly basis. In conclusion, I think that having gone through all of these numbers, you can see that Donald Trump has a core of support, which is a comment I've been making for a long time now, who wants somebody who represents their views, who is willing to articulate things about deporting immigrants, or at least take a very hard stance on the issue of immigration when it comes to undocumented workers being in the United States. They don't care so much about his electability, and in particular, if they've seen him on television before, they're going to have a bit of a apprentice effect lens that might always present Trump's performances in a more positive light in comparison with people who've not watched him on television. I don't see Donald Trump going away anytime soon. He's got a nice broad base of support. He's got some key demographics that are behind him. He's got the apprentice effect. If they have a positive view of him, I think it's going to be harder for them to adopt a negative view because they're kind of used to who Donald is. And most importantly, he's done all of this without spending basically hardly any money at all. He's not put up national ads. He's building up his machinery in terms of his infrastructure, but he's not hired tons of consultants, and he's not going through his money. Jeb Bush, on the other hand, who came in with shock and awe and fundraising machismo, is going to end up spending most of that just to try to get back into double digits. 3 months ago, I probably would have put my money on Jeb Bush to be the establishment candidate, and my opinion of him as a candidate has done nothing but gone down since he started running. He's a gaffe machine. He's inarticulate, he's tone deaf, and he's not putting forward ideas that are getting people excited. So I guess at this point, he's going to have to spend a lot of his own money, just to try to climb back into the double digits. This 4% result is kind of devastating in my opinion, and I've said in previous videos, if I was a Jeb Bush donor, I would basically be writing off my investment at this point. So the question now is, can Marco Rubio become that establishment alternative? Can he bear the weight of the spotlight? Can he raise the money? Can he put together a machine on the ground to help him get elected, having never done it before? And that is going to be his testing ground, because unlike Jeb, ! He doesn't have an entire family history of structure and donors and networks to build on across the nation. That's his sort of weakness, that he's known in Florida, but that doesn't necessarily translate into getting people to support you and tapping into those long-term volunteers who go and knock on doors across the country. I hope you found this interesting. I go through these numbers and I look at this kind of stuff and I build these pictures in my head, and it seems a bit of a waste to not share them with you. So if you've enjoyed this content, I have a few other videos you might want to check out. You can check the politics playlist here on my channel. Otherwise, keep coming back for more political analysis of the 2016 presidential race. I will be putting up videos as and when I have something interesting to say. So until the next time we see each other, I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Thank you so much for watching to the end of the video, and we'll see each other soon. Bye.